Welcome to part 2 of By the Numbers, selected Midrash on the Torah portion of Bamidbar. Today we are going to take a look at Mount Sinai. We're not actually going to go to Mount Sinai, but we are going to see some interesting pictures and some interesting discussion about where Mount Sinai is located, and it stems from this Midrash. Let me read to you this Midrash. I do not have the English translation for this Midrash available to you. Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe b'midbar Sinai. God spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai. Shisha Shemos nikru lo. There are 6 names that were given to this mountain. Har Elohim, the mountain of God. Har Bashan. We'll see why Bashan soon enough. Har Gob Noonim, another name that we'll see what the meaning is. Har Moriah. It says here Har Moriah, Mount Moriah, but that's inaccurate. It's actually a scribal error. It's very clear from later on in this Midrash that what is intended instead of that, let me just work my way down, is Har Chomed. Okay, so let's read that as Har Chomed, Mount Chomed. Again, we'll have to see the reason why. Har Chorev, Mount Chorev, which is a somewhat popular name. A lot of people are aware that it's also called that. And of course, Har Sinai. Now, the Midrash is going to explain why there are 6 different names for this mountain. And we're going to go one by one. First, Har Elohim. Why is it called the Mountain of God? Sheyeshev bo Elohim badin. God sat on it in judgment. How so? Shenemar, as it says, V'elah ha-mishpatim. These are the mishpatim. God at Mount Sinai gave over the mishpatim, gave over the civil laws as well. In civil law, a judge is called Elohim. That's actually not just the name of God, it's actually the name of a judge. And what the Midrash is pointing out here is that it's called Har Elohim, the mountain of God, the mountain of judgment, that just as the judges were empowered there at Mount Sinai, so too God sat there as the great judge of the Jewish people. So therefore it's called the mountain of judgment, Har Elohim, or the mountain of the judge. Har Bashan, why is it called Mount Bashan? Shebasham HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because God came to that mountain. Now you'll say Basham and Bashan are different words, but the Nun and the Mem, especially in the Jerusalem Talmud, in many of the exegetical statements, the Mem and the Nun are interchangeable as far as they're concerned. So it's instead of Bashan, it's Basham. They're saying it's a pun of some sort, or it's flipped the letters. But the idea is that God came to that mountain. It's the only mountain that God ever came to. So therefore it has the name of Bashan. Har Gob Noonim, the mountain of Gob Noonim. Why is it called that? Har Shepasal Kol Ha'arim. It is the mountain which made all the other mountains pasol. It negated or delegitimized the other mountains. Kishem Sha'ata Omer O Gibein O Dak. There's an expression in the Torah. It talks about, when it's talking about the psul, the various disqualifications for a priest, physical disqualifications. So one of them is Gibein. It has something to do with the eye. But the idea is it's called Gob Noonim because just as a Gibein, just as that particular defect would disqualify a Kohen, would say you're not a Kohen, so too Mount Sinai did that to the other mountains. How so? Because at Mount Sinai, we, and really everyone, it was reinforced for everyone, but there's a commandment not to worship idols. And on all the other mountains, they used to put the idols, right? They used to worship their idols up on the mountains. The Torah says this in the book of, I believe in Deuteronomy. It talks about Al-Harim, Haramim, Al-Harim, Haramim, on the high mountains. They used to place their idols on the high mountains. So Same thing. These mountains were disqualified. Once God came on Mount Sinai and said, "This is my mountain, I am God, there's one God, no idol worship." So all the other mountains became Gibeon. They became defective in a way which they were disqualified from service. Even though they've been served there previously, now we know that's all wrong, and the right service is the service we're doing at Mount Sinai. Har Chomed. The word Chomed, the Mount Chomed, Chomed is desire. Shechomar HaKadosh Baruch Hu leishev sham. That God chose, desired to sit there. What's the point of this name? So interestingly, all right, you would think if God were giving the Torah, he would do it at some dramatic mountain. Can we pick a dramatic mountain? I don't know, do it at the Matterhorn. That would be impressive, right? Do it at, Mount Everest, the highest mountain. But God didn't choose those mountains. He chose these mountains. He chose this mountain. He chose Mount Sinai. So why did God choose Mount Sinai? We don't know, but we call it Har Chemed, the mountain of God's desire, because even though it was an inferior mountain, and we'll see that it's not a particularly high mountain when we take a look at it shortly, all right, but still God desired to be there. So that's why it's called Har Chomed. Har Chorev, it's called Chorev from the word Cherev, says the Mishnah. Cherev is a sword. She'olav nishmata Cherev, because on it the sword was drawn out of its sheath. Shenemar mos yumas hanoef hanoafes, mos yumas harotzeach. The death penalty for things like adultery and murder, the death penalty was instituted at Mount Sinai for these things, and therefore it's called Har Chorev because of the Cherev, because of the sword, that it was a place where the death penalty was put forward for serious sins. And Har Sinai, why Sinai? So Sinai sounds like Sinah, hatred. The letters are different, but again, in Midrash, especially in non-halachic Midrash, like these types of Midrashim, where we're not discussing Jewish law, they feel very free to substitute and swap letters. So here, Har Sinai, Shebo Nisnu Umos Ha'olam LaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because on it, the nations of the world became less favored to God. It actually says they became hated to God. V'nosan lahem apophasim. And God gave to the nations of the world their decrees that they were all going to ultimately fail, because unlike the Jewish people who stood at Mount Sinai, who got the true religion, all of these nations were misled. Shenemar, as the verse says, V'agoyim chorov yecharovu. Isaiah says that the nations will be put to the sword. Okay. Finally, at the end of the Mishnah, the end of the Midrash just repeats the last point that we made in a different way. So we have all these different names for Mount Sinai, and all of them apparently they hint to something else. They're homiletical in nature. They hint to some other idea which was prevalent at Mount Sinai. We're coming up to the holiday of Shavuos. So I would also like to point out that on the holiday of Shavuos, right, where we received the Torah at Mount Sinai, right, so very often we like to imagine our heads, what would it be like, etc., etc. Where was Mount Sinai, right? We all want to know, where was Mount Sinai, right? It says here, B'midbar Sinai. So the archaeological discussion is a very interesting one, but let's start with what's obvious. Mount Sinai is not in the Sinai Desert. That location was chosen by I think it was one of the emperors, might have been Constantine, that was designated as that's where Mount Sinai is, and they built a monastery, St. Catherine's Monastery, I believe, and they built it there and they put it up on the mountain, and that was Mount Sinai. That's not Mount Sinai for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that the physical description of Mount Sinai in the Torah doesn't match up at all. The physical description of Mount Sinai in the Torah indicates that it was a place where you could encamp hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people could encamp in that area. When you look at the picture of Mount Sinai, and I'm showing you now, I'll show you on the screen a picture of the Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula. When you look at it, and I'll show you an aerial picture, there's nowhere around it. It's one mountain in the midst of a bunch of other mountains. There's nowhere to encamp. In fact, it would appear archaeologically that Mount Sinai, what we talk about as Mount Sinai, is actually Jebel al-Lawz. I'm showing it to you on a map now. Jebel al-Lawz is located in modern-day Saudi Arabia. It is to the east and south of modern-day Eilat. And it happens to be that we know that a number of the places identified in the Torah as being near Mount Sinai are located in that area. Okay, so Jebel al-Lawz, which I believe means the mountain of the law, if I remember correctly. But no matter what, Jebel al-Lawz appears to be the correct Mount Sinai. There are a number of things that argue in its favor. One is, as I again show you the aerial view, as you can see that on one side of the mountain, there's actually a huge plain where people could encamp. That's important enough. But also, if you look at the end of the description of the revelation at Sinai, which I believe is at the end of Pashas Mishpatim, and it talks about that they had 12 altars and they offered up animals on those altars, etc. And they set up pillars and altars. Right? Those pillars and altars are still there at Jebel al-Lawz. I'm showing you some pictures now. I'll put up a couple of pictures on the screen, but it would appear that archaeologically the evidence is there that this in fact was the location. The Saudis actually closed this location for a long time. I believe they recently opened it up to tourism, but it would appear archaeologically that this is in fact the correct Mount Sinai. Also, when you go up on Jebel al-Lawz, you can find a cave. There's a cave network that's similar to what's described, right? The prophet, I believe it's Isaiah. Isaiah goes up to Mount Sinai, right? He hides in a cave. You got to have caves. Anyway, the archaeological evidence would seem to point to Jebel al-Lawz, which is in modern-day Saudi Arabia, that it's not, the mountain that we call Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula. So when we're naming a mountain and we're thinking about this mountain and we're thinking about it in our Torah portion, it's good to have some idea of the exact location of the mountain that we're talking about. So now we have a better idea. I have given a course in the past on the Exodus from Egypt and the path of the Exodus, and therefore where Mount Sinai is. That's available to you via recordings. If you would like it, just let me know. But otherwise, thank you for being with us for part 2 of By the Numbers, Select Midrash from the Book of Numbers. Thanks for being with us, and we'll be back with the next installment tomorrow. Bye-bye.